I'm going to do to you today. I'm going to present to you two substantive from my speech. Number one, on the nature of the MNCs and how this whole sanction isn't the right way to do it. And secondly, on the role of the government and whether or not they have a moral imperative to actually change the situation in another country that's not their own. But before that, let's tackle the very problematic things that came up from the Prime Minister. Because firstly, his whole entire premise is based on one example, which is that of Apple and Foxconn. And even more problematic is when they say that the suicides are directly related to these people who are actually fighting for their workers' right. My dear, you have to understand that these suicides are not because they are fighting for their workers' right, it's because they are depressed. And this depression, even though we concede that it is a problem from the MSC side, we have to ask this very simple question that side government has failed to prove in the BN speech. Does this form of sanctioning of the trade solve the problem that's happening in the company itself? Because what we heard from side government is that they will do it because apparently it will improve the situation, but never really explaining to us how, right? Because you have to understand that when we come into economy and when we come to trade, right, just because you are performing trade, it doesn't mean that you agree principally with it. We have other examples such as Malaysia, for example, allowing Starbucks and McDonald's to start their company here, but that doesn't mean that they're supporting their Zionists and their pro-Jewish sentiments. Because you have to understand that trade and human rights affairs are totally distinguishable affairs that should not come into play. Because we have seen a lot of trades happening among countries, especially in this time of globalization, where you see that just because they're doing it from the side of economy doesn't mean that there is approval towards what they are doing. There are always other sides of the government. For example, leave it to the Secretary of Defense, right, or the foreign ministers to actually discuss all the human rights affairs. We believe that when it comes to trade for the benefit of the people and society itself, you let it be. Because another thing that's very funny coming up from them, my member of the chair actually questioned that whether or not is it because of the company itself. We say no, because let's understand the nature of why this abuse even happened, right? Because you have to understand the nature of China is they have very lax labor laws, and that is the main problem that we're talking about today. MNCs are not there to actually blatantly abuse. They are mainly taking the loophole that's already present in the country itself to actually sort of, in what you say, abuse. Because once again, we question the old concept of abuse, right? Because abuse is very subjective towards the whole country. What is stated as abuse in the country that actually produces that may not be abuse in China itself. Because you see, Foxconn still retains its very high employment rate, and there are still people who are entering Foxconn. So we see the problem that they're talking about, which is human rights abuse, isn't that dire at all. Because there are still people who are waiting in line to actually enter Foxconn, and that shows how important Foxconn is to China, right? And the second thing that they say, which I feel very problematic, is that trading equals accepting their own principle. Mr. Speaker, Madam Chair, you have to understand that the debate today is on trade alone and not on human rights affairs. Because we see America itself carries out trade with a lot of countries, but that doesn't mean that America, the example that they cited, agree with a lot of their principles. Because you have to understand, America basically disagrees with the whole world. That's not their ally. And that doesn't mean that they stop trade with the rest of the world. We see that there is always this distinguishable line that the government must take whether or not to actually encroach another country's sovereignty or actually to protect their own rights of the people. So now, before I move on to my substantive NPI,
isn't taking loopholes and finding all these loopholes a form of abuse of labour laws itself?
And that is what our stance of today is about, Madam Chair. The stance is very simple. We consider that there is a problem in the country itself when it comes to labour law. But our question is, does the form of sanction from them actually solve the issue? We say no, because we believe that there will be a form of organic change that will come in time. When international pressure comes into play, when this kind of form of countries actually improve their labour law over time, when they move from a developing country to a developed country status, and how to actually improve in time under this form of pressure, and we feel that an outright sanction immediately won't solve the problem. In fact, it will hurt the people on the ground, which is what my deputy leader of the opposition is going to talk about, right? So, moving on to my substantive, right? Number one, on the nature of MNCs. On three different levels. Number one, on how MNCs are inevitable. Because side government gave you a very big representation of what MNCs are, right? They never truly explain to us what they are selling except Apple. Let me just give you a very clear analysis of what they are. MNCs are responsible for things such as pharmaceutical companies, such as Novartis and Pfizer, technological companies such as Apple and Samsung. And we see what are the nature of these things that they produce, right? They are all essentials, Madam Speaker. We are talking about drugs, we're talking about technologies, we're talking about things related to transportation itself. And when these kind of things, there are always a need and demand for this kind of thing. And when you have a demand for this, naturally, if you follow the law of economies, supply will come. And we see that what their side is doing is screwing up the whole economy of the country itself, right? Because eventually what they're doing is they're curbing basically they are curbing the supply even though there is an excess demand for the needs that these MNCs are producing. What they are doing is they are causing a need for these stakes, and it will increase and cause inflation of these prices of these stakes now. Because you have to understand the nature of these companies themselves, they cannot produce this form of things. They still rely on Apple, like what they say, they still rely on Pfizer to actually produce the things that they need. And when they stop this form of trade, where are the drugs and where are the technologies going to come from? Never really explained from side opposition, right? We have to understand that the very sole reason is that the countries need it. Secondly, MNCs form a source of investment. Because you have to understand the countries that actually produce all these Apple, Pfizer, Novartis, they're all Switzerland, France, and USA or UK, for example. All of them have a very big stake in the economy itself. Because you have to understand MNCs form a big percentage of the country's economy. And what their side fail to understand is when you put a stop to their production, it essentially affects the macroeconomy of the whole country, because they are now stopping the only direct stake in the economy, which are the MNCs themselves. And third level, right, on how MNCs are performing necessary evil. Because we have to understand, even though we are talking about this evil, they are not necessarily bad. Because you have to understand that this country, in order to do this, they have to always maintain this form of low price for the consumers themselves. What they are doing is simply trying to reduce the cost of purchase for the item itself. We believe that this is beneficial to people on all grounds, and right, is very much needed, right? But secondly, let's look at the role of the government, something that side opposition government completely mischaracterized, right? We have to understand that there are two things when it comes to the role of the government. Number one, protecting the consumers' right. You have to understand that consumers have the right to purchase whatever they want, because when they sign this form of social contract with the government itself, they consider that they have to give up part of their rights in exchange for security and also rights. We believe that this form of right of purchase and the social contract that you sign with the government does not call for you to actually stop the trade of something that has nothing to do with your own country at all. Because you have to understand what side government is proposing is performing a sanction on another country where it has nothing to do directly with the country itself. Their policy is not benefiting their own country. In fact, it's causing a harm by restricting the freedom of choice and the consumer's right in the country itself. Because we see there is no form of moral imperative on their side to actually explain to us why the United States of America should actually stop trade with another country simply because they feel that it's wrong for them because they're abusing the labor law. Because we see status quo has been called for all these things to happen. There are other avenues to stop, but stopping trade is never one of them, and we believe that side government should protect their own people and not people of another country. With that, go with side opposition.